Absolutely. And I really do come at this from an international development professional perspective. And I think also it's important for me to note that the bulk of my time working, especially with USAID, I was largely in biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. So I think that a lot of people will think automatically that I am maybe anti-mining. Um, that I would come from a perspective of saying, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, it's
Hmm.
damaging. And I would echo some of what Barack was talking about in terms of embodied human rights and just how complicated the sector gets in general. Um, and just to focus on that traceability aspect a little bit, I think that we we struggle with that in so many things, particularly in critical minerals. The traceability issues are huge, particularly in certain regions of the world where it gets really hard to below the smelting below the smelting, that traceability becomes a real problem. But I wanted to thank Barack because I think that he talked a lot about things that I could talk about. But what I'd like to say is that I don't come from a perspective of, we should be limiting mining or zero mining. I'm really coming from a place of, um, we need to think about mining as a sector that matters, as a sector that should have more transparency and that more people should be aware of what really happens on the ground. Um, it, Mining is really important for growth in mineral rich countries. It's really important for the energy transition. And I think that that's something that certainly in my profession is a constant topic. And it's really important for the communities who live where the gold and copper and iron ore and all of these other things happen to be. Um, and I think that what we often get is we're not getting the projects that we actually need, the ones that hold together for investors, for communities, and for host countries. And so those those kinds of projects, the ones that really hold together for all of these different stakeholders, they're succeeding where a lot of what I've seen over the course of the past 15 to 20 years, they are failing. Um, and so here I would just talk about this idea of certainty. And I liked, again, the comment about certainty versus uncertainty. And I'm not sure I would necessarily argue that very hard. But I think that I'd rather talk about that idea of absence of risk, or because it's very difficult to overcome all risks, having a credible model for navigating risks. And I think the biggest threat to certainty in mineral projects really comes above the ground. Um, it's a development question and an investment question joined together. And I think that we learned certainly from Sarah's talk that the term certainty definitely means different things to different people. And I really loved her talk. It was super interesting. So let's talk about different kinds of vantage points on that, on uncertainty and risk. So if you're an investor, you might be thinking about returns and timelines. How can you model assets? How can you put a number on it? Operator certainty, maybe more about execution, hitting milestones, not being blindsided by some event that nobody could have really predicted. Certainly, the host government has a different perspective. Does the project deliver on revenue, jobs, infrastructure, advancing national strategy, and more importantly, not becoming a political liability? And then communities, risks, and uncertainty. And in my experience, this receives insufficient investment, insufficient attention. Um, do the people who live next to a project who are relocated because of it benefit directly, or at least not lose because of a project? And I think that issues in this area are apparent at the community level quickly, and will have significant impacts on success. I mean, and all of the other levels of certainty up the chain. Now, I mean, these areas really don't align perfectly, but you really want to work towards alignment and towards mutual benefits. Um, so breakdowns. Um, I really see several areas of failure modes, and I don't think anybody here would be surprised on what they are. So and in my experience, looking at the projects where I've worked, and pretty heavily across West and Central Africa, it doesn't take very long. Talk to like one or two stakeholders and almost predict what's going to happen. And so we can just talk about some of them. Administrative holdups. Permits don't get stuck because of paperwork, in my experience. They get stuck because of shifting politics. Were the connections sufficient? Did people have enough intelligence to understand what might change and what might happen? Was there too much optimism? Optimism, I think, is one thing I see quite a lot. And do you ignore the context telling you where things might not work out the way you're planning, especially in timelines? And I think that, there's specific examples of major mining projects, certainly in West Africa, where you see a timeline of like 10 years and multiple permitting regimes over different administrations. So then, we have elite capture. I think that this is a big risk area. So did you negotiate your permits with a minister who may not survive a cabinet reshuffle? That's real exposure. And from a development standpoint, that's a social contract signed with one or maybe a few people, and not with a country or the communities that will be most impacted and frankly stand to lose the most. And then we have local grievance. Grievances rarely end cleanly. Water, power disputes, these become national news stories. They become major risks to investment, reputation. The cost of catching those signals early is relatively small, but the cost of catching it late is really big for all parties, and especially for communities whose grievances were very real to begin with. And this can come in the shape of insufficient planning, communications, execution of relocation operations, infrastructure development, resource access restrictions. Those are just a couple of things. Workforce disputes are another one. And then the last, and I think that this is really consistent, is an unrealistic assumption about who has the most influence on the ground. It's difficult sometimes to know that without a lot of groundwork, a lot of time spent understanding traditional authority, informal networks. Sometimes diaspora dynamics come into play, religious leadership, elite capture again. And sometimes these matter more than formal connections made in planning. So I'll make one of those concrete. A company can be excellent at operations, really good at safety and security protocols, really good at the infrastructure development necessary. And they do everything right on paper, right? ESG planning, engagement plans, community investment commitments, they're all budgeted, but they don't have capacity and haven't made the effort to invest in their soft skills, to build the unit within their ranks, to forge and maintain relationships, to ensure co-benefits and ensure information flow. I saw one mine cycle through staff within this department because they really hadn't properly invested in the function. In one case, the first iteration of the team embezzled the budget. They were replaced by a small group with better experience, but no requisite language skills. So that didn't work out. Um, and then, to rectify the situation, they actually pulled an engineer from the mining operation to try to set things right. It's not the best workable solution. And what you're seeing here is a mine that really is trying to do the right thing, not being able to make good on their commitments on the timeline that's expected. And it just starts to create that tension. So I also think that, just one quick observation is that the energy transition is making things harder in a lot of ways. I think that mineral demand is rising in a way that I don't think maybe we've experienced before. And any speed games have a high likelihood of coming at the expense of engagement work that might de-risk projects. So, um, so how do we, how do we try to overcome some of this? I'd say we really need to put the work in on the ground first, map the actors, map the, you need the influence map. Who matters? Why do they matter? What do they want? What are they afraid of? Um, it not only does it need to be done rigorously, it needs to be kept current, because the landscape can change in a lot of these mineral rich regions very quickly. We cannot take stability for granted. Um, and then, we need to identify triggers. Um, there's a set of events that, if they happen, will materially change the operating environment. Elections, for example, commodity prices, local leadership transition, transboundary issues, a natural disaster or a disease outbreak, read COVID or Ebola. Um, you have to we have to be planning for those triggers in advance, and decide what that means for the project at the outset. Testing scenarios is important. It's not generic risk registers, but locally grounded scenarios that connect political and social events to the operational realities. What happens if a minister loses their portfolio? If a key local leader passes away, what's that continuity plan? What does community investment commitment look like with new leadership, for example? And then, making sure that you've built engagement pathways. Trust is not a campaign, it's relationships and feedback loops. And I'll say, from the development perspective side, the early signals they're there. Civil society networks, community-led monitoring, human rights documentation. Um, it's in the conversations that communities are having long before they might come and actually complain directly. And I think that, again, this goes back um, to talking about really that early investment and investing in your soft skills. I can tell you that during my time with USAID, multiple times mining companies would come to USAID and say, hey, we're having this major issue. Um, and we haven't budgeted properly. And can you come and help us with this? I mean, as a as a foreign assistance donor at the time, you're not able to solve all of the problems. There are partnership arrangements that USA definitely engaged with, that I think, in my personal capacity, that I think were helpful. But having those early investments in soft skills is just critical, and you cannot get by without it. The exposure is real. I'm sorry, I could drone on about this for a very long time, but I want to give you a chance to interact with me.
No, Melody, this is absolutely, absolutely fantastic and fascinating. And I guess the thought that is sitting in my mind at the moment, so I'm lucky in that I get to work with lots of different exploration and mining project development companies, as well as the mining companies. And the majority of the exploration companies, when you start talking about grievances, human rights, etc., you get blank looks coming back at you. They just
Yeah.
don't know why this is important. And I wonder, the problem is as well is because often they're very small companies, they don't have a lot of money to spend. and the priority for them is on, well, we want to go and check out if there are juicy rocks in the ground. And if there are, then we'll start doing this stuff. And that's the problem because actually it's almost like what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
I just think that you find yourself in a quagmire, because once you start looking, right, you're already raising expectations. The
Yeah.
expectations are there almost immediately, and the forces that will come around to try to be part of and benefit from a project are already there, and understanding all of those different dynamics is important really early on. I mean, I've seen mines, because again, mines can be in really incredible drivers of economic growth. I mean, I've seen them increase stability, really increase the attractiveness of, moving to an area and like capacity building, and, it can be really impressive. Um, but you're looking at population growth in ways that are un, are not known yet. And, this is where you get into that scenario planning and really trying to think through what it means for, all, I mean, relocation, for, water quality, for, food security. I mean, these are basic things that can really change in a region.
So Melody, if let's imagine we're in a world where you're actually the CEO of an exploration company.
Oh dear.
But how would you do it? How would you start to work out like, well, where do I go? Would you come at this from that above ground risk perspective and then go, right, I've kind of got all of that information. Now let's bring in that geological understanding and that map and where those two things intersect. Right, off we go. Yeah, I mean, how would you do it?
I mean, it's complicated, right? I mean, this is why, you were saying that it's art, when Sarah was talking. Well, I mean, this is art. Um, I think that really getting good local contacts, and I don't mean starting in a capital city necessarily,
Mm,
because you need to understand regional, ethnic, linguistic differences and how they interact. So I do think it is really worthwhile to get some good solid intelligence from the outset, and to be thinking about how to maintain contacts and how to maintain sort of that momentum. And I think that another thing is trying to understand a bunch of different weird things like land tenure. Land tenure is really complicated. And, you can have people popping up who think they have a claim, maybe not official, maybe not, formal, but informal land claims are also really important. Um, and so kind of getting a sense of some of the real big flashing issues that you might find before you start to raise expectations, because things get much more complicated when there's money.
mm, absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, Melody, I could sit asking you questions all day because I think this is absolutely fascinating. But unfortunately, we've reached our time, and I'm just going to say a massive thank you on behalf of all of us for coming along today and blowing our minds with so much information that was brilliant. Thank you very much, Melody.
Thank
Brilliant.
you.